the next motion would not be put, so we go to Government Order of the Day number 2.
Moving on to the Amendment Bill committee stage.
I declare the House in committee for consideration of the student loan amendment scheme. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker. Honourable members, kia ora tātou, nō reira te whare, inga iwi, inga rio, inga hawewha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, honourable members. The House is in committee on the Student Loan Scheme Amendment Bill. The question is that Part 1 stand part, and it's debate on Part 1, clauses 3 through to 33.
Mr. Chair.
I recognise the honourable member, Grant Robertson.
And I recognise the Chair too. Seen him somewhere before. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chair, for giving me the call on this bill. Part 1 of this bill is in fact pretty much all of the bill. It's all of the substantive clauses of the bill. So in this first call, I'm going to make some general remarks around what's contained in the bill and where it's going, and then perhaps move on to some more specific issues that I have concerns about coming up. The first thing to note about this bill is that there are a large number of mainly technical amendments contained within the bill that are around essentially tidying up matters to do with the student loan scheme. The student loan scheme frequently needs legislation like this because it's a complex beast. The interaction between the tertiary institutions, StudyLink, and the Inland Revenue Department and StudyLink's predecessors have always caused some difficulties and issues. And from time to time, things like the Inland Revenue Department decides to change its computer system, and that means the law has to change. I sometimes think we've got things a little bit wrong in the student loan scheme when that's the case. But there are some matters in here that are of very limited controversy that are perhaps. You do sometimes wonder whether really need legislative change, if there isn't some other mechanism that could be used to advance the changes that are in here. So those issues are not going to get a lot of attention later, to do with things such as changes to the names of the repayment codes, the way in which certain types of earnings are treated. But the issues that are going to get more attention, I suspect, in this debate, Mr. Chair, are around the issues to do with the changes to the repayment holiday. Before I come to those, one major issue that's been picked up in this bill is the question of a contact person for a borrower who is overseas. Now, when we look at the student loan scheme and the interest-free element of it, the key element that the interest-free loan scheme has had is that if somebody remains in New Zealand, they won't be charged interest. If they go away overseas, they will be. But we have had from the beginning of the loan scheme the issue of what happens when borrowers go overseas. Now, I'm actually, in principle, no great fan of the student loan scheme, but once it's existed, we do need to make sure that there is robust processes, or there are robust processes in place to ensure that people are making the repayments that they are obliged to do. And there have been examples of people travelling overseas and not making the loan repayments that we would expect them to make. And that is unfair on other borrowers. So no matter what someone like me or anyone else might think of the student loan scheme in principle, we need to ensure that borrowers who are making repayments do not look at other people and see them and say, why is that person not making a repayment just because they've gone overseas? So if a borrower is overseas, I think it is a reasonable expectation that they will make arrangements to make payments. And many parents around New Zealand who will no doubt be glued to their crystal sets right now listening to this debate will be saying, yes, I am familiar with that. I know that my own mother for many years received the student loan information relating to my brother, who had long since left New Zealand. He was making payments, I hasten to add, but parents all around New Zealand will be familiar with the fact that they have remained the contact point effectively for their children when they go overseas. And many of them are very diligent in making sure that payments are made and that information is kept up to date. So what this bill does, however, is ensure that it elevates essentially the role of a contact person. And I do think there are some questions about that. I certainly believe that some people, when they see the changes that are being made to the role of a contact person, they will actually start to think, do I want to be that contact person? Because this means that they will have regular communication. There'll be communication right at the beginning about what their roles and responsibilities are. I don't think the reality is that it's greatly different than the situation now, but I do think it will elevate what that person's role is, and it does beg the question over time as to whether there may be some intent to have some liability for that person, but that isn't, I respect at this time, isn't the intent. But I do think it's worth the House just taking a little bit of time to consider what it means now for somebody to be listed as a contact point. It isn't actually going to, as I say, greatly change that role, but it does mean that the person will be contacted regardless of whether the borrower has defaulted on their payments, because at the moment that would be pretty much the only situation in which a contact person would be contacted. Now they're going to be contacted as a matter of course once the person's listed. A person has to be listed, and so therefore, Mr. Chair.
Grant Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So therefore, it does increase the attention that a contact person will get. So I just think the House does need to reflect on that. We don't want to set up a situation where, for instance, parents don't feel that they want to be a contact person for their children because it's going to lead to some kind of increased scrutiny on them. I don't have a problem in principle with having to supply some kind of contact details and contact information, but I do think there are some matters here to consider in that regard. But Mr. Chair, I want to move now to the question of the repayment period changes that are listed in this particular bill. And on the table are supplementary order papers of remarkably similar nature between the Green MP, Holly Walker, and myself, thinking alike here about the change the government's made. So to clarify for those watching, the government is proposing to reduce the repayment holiday that currently stands at 3 years to 1 year. Now, the repayment holiday comes into force when someone goes overseas, typically a young New Zealander on their OE. And they go overseas and they are not obliged under the repayment holiday provisions to make repayments on their loan. They are accruing interest because that is the term of the student loan, the interest-free student loan scheme, that if you are overseas, you will accrue interest. So they're not getting a free ride, they are actually accruing interest. What the repayment holiday has acknowledged is that New Zealanders have a long tradition of going away overseas, often shortly after they graduate, and taking some time to experience the world and then coming back to New Zealand. The minister in the chair understood this in 2007 when, as a minister in a Labour government, he in fact oversaw the repayment holiday going to 3 years. And I want to quote the minister because I do think what he said here is important. He said the reality, he's talking about graduates overseas, the reality they all faced was a very massive debt upon their return to New Zealand, which in some cases would be enough for them to make the decision not to come home at all, and our country would be the loser. We needed to take a pragmatic way through this. And this is this minister in the chair, and being someone who places great virtue on pragmatism, don't think there's any doubt about that, it struck me that the logical course of action was to derive the solution that we have, to extend the holiday period for 3 years, recognising the fact that young New Zealanders take that extended period overseas. I could not agree more with the minister. It is a pragmatic response to that. 5 years ago. It's all changed in the 5 years. All changed in the 5 years from the minister. Unfortunately, 5 years ago and now, the pattern of movement of young graduates going overseas is actually exactly the same. Now, the country that most or many New Zealanders go for their overseas experience is the UK. And the UK allows for 2 years on there. In Finland, goodness William, some people do. We do have a working holiday visa exchange with Finland. We may not anymore after this week, but we did have it. But typically, most graduates would find their way to the UK, and they will spend that 2 year period, and possibly a little longer. Most people know that it is possible to get extensions on those visas when you're away. So it seems to me that this change that's been proposed by the government actually flies in the face of what is the typical behaviour of graduates overseas. That is what makes it wrong, but it's also been pointed out to the government that it actually isn't going to achieve the things that the government wants it to do. The Treasury told the government in the budget documents that there's little evidence that this change will improve repayments. It's actually likely to increase the debt held by overseas borrowers, discouraging them from returning and therefore increase the annual student loans impairment. And that's the very point that Mr Dunn noted, that the pragmatic way through this, the thing to do to actually encourage people to come back to New Zealand was to leave a period of either 3 years or, and as one, I've got two supplementary order papers, one for 3 years, but we could compromise, Mr Dunn, between 1 and 3, go for 2 years. There's also, that is pragmatic, there is also that supplementary order paper on the table, because I think that is more realistic. It's more common sense, Moanamaki, that's right, that to actually fit it around what students, what graduates rather, actually do. But we have to bear in mind that the Treasury is pointing out what this is likely to do is increase debt and therefore discourage people from coming back to New Zealand. So the two things that we would have thought the government wanted to do in a bill like this, reduce the debt, get the New Zealanders who are overseas back home, both worked against. It wasn't just the Treasury, Mr Chair, it was also the Ministry of Education who said this can be expected to have a negative impact at the margin on borrowers' decisions regarding whether to return to New Zealand. So simply, this bill is both wrong in terms of the fact that it doesn't make common sense, and it's also not going to achieve the goals.
Honourable Peter Dunn.
Chairman, I thought I should take a call at this point because I'm the one common link in the chain that the Minister...